Hello and welcome to this talk on attachment theory. I won't be assuming any prior knowledge. This is an introductory talk for those who are interested, not necessarily people in the world of psychotherapy or counselling, but anybody really who has an interest in psychology. I'm going to press the right button and we're going to start. Emotional connections, attachments that we make at the very start of our lives are going to shape all future relationships. If we think of those things which happen very early on, immediately after birth in our lives, are laying down a foundation. And that's what attachment is. It's those early relationships upon which we're going to build an adult life. And as we go through this, we'll see how important that is, that the very nature of the attachments we make at the start is going to predetermine what we think of and what we expect from relationships later in life. So John Bowlby developed attachment theory from about the 1940s into the 1980s. The interesting thing about attachment theory is it's more than of interest to the world of psychology. It had a major impact on childcare across the board. It impacted on education, health and social care and other areas. It's one of those theories that had a wide-ranging influence. Primarily we talk about children, but the influence it had is as much about adults as it is for children, as we're going to see as we go through. Another factor which I think is crucial to attachment theory was the impact on children during World War II. Families were totally disrupted, as you can see from the photo. Children were sent away as evacuees away from the cities that were going to be bombed. There was a massive disruption to family life, and the impacts and repercussions of that disruption were to go on through into the 50s and 60s as that generation grew up. And Bowlby's works really comes in the wake of this experience for a whole generation of children. Here we have a picture of Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby. We could call them the mother and father of attachment theory. They worked out of the Tavistock Clinic in North London, which is still in operation. Many psychologists have worked and been associated with the Tavistock. What is interesting about Bowlby's and Mary Ainsworth's work is they used an enormous amount of data. Children were referred to them who had been traumatized or suffering from mental health issues. And what John Bowlby did was he not only looked at what the children were saying and dealt with them, he also looked at the families and the mothers. And case histories, family histories were taken extensively, and that mass of data was used to build up the picture of attachment. Mary Ainsworth developed experiments whereby they could test these theories. It sounds awful, doesn't it, that children were experimented on, but it really wasn't that bad or traumatic for them. And we're going to see later the kind of experiments that she conducted. So Mary Ainsworth was an American psychologist. She came to London in the 1950s and began her work with Bowlby. She was in London really almost by accident, in as much as that her husband had got a job in London, and so she followed him here. So it was a happy accident that she was in London to work with Bowlby, and her contribution is pretty enormous. John Bowlby himself was a British psychologist and psychiatrist, psychoanalyst. He was born in London to a middle-class family, as you can see from his birth date, 1907, which was particular for families at that time is that they would have nannies who he was close to, who would have done the majority of his care. And when he was 7, he was sent to boarding school. Now, I think this is significant. John Bowlby was later to say, "I wouldn't send a dog to boarding school at 7 years old." Theories don't come up out of the blue. Theories come out of people's experience. And I think John Bowlby's traumatic experience of going to boarding school at an early age shaped the interest that he had in attachments and the importance of attachments, and particularly the importance of disruptions and difficulties in attachments. So we're going to look at the influences on Bowlby's work. One important influence would have been Melanie Klein, who would have been working at the Tavistock through the 20s and 30s. Her work with children was, I think, crucial in establishing how Bowlby was to himself work with young children and mothers. She didn't invent play therapy, but she really did develop it to a huge extent. She herself worked with mothers and children, and from their experiences, from what the children were telling her, she was able to extrapolate really a great deal of adult psychology, and a great deal of adult experience was learned from the observation and treatment of young children. So I think Melanie Klein plays a crucial part in the foundation of attachment theory. Another influence was Konrad Lorenz, who worked with animals, and in particular worked with imprinting in ducklings. What Konrad did was he studied animals and how they attached to the first large moving object they met when the ducklings hatched out. It's interesting that the ducklings, because they would see him first, they would assume and attach to him as their mother, and the ducklings would follow him around and do exactly what he did because they had imprinted on him. Now this suggests that attachment is innate and programmed genetically. It's not something that the young animal chooses to do, it's something the animal does automatically, and the same applies for humans. Another, not so much influence, but working really just before at the same time as John Bowlby, was Dr. Harry Harlow. He was working in America, and his experiments on rhesus monkeys and trying to determine the attachment to their mothers. These experiments, I think you can still view them on YouTube, but I wouldn't recommend it. They're quite harrowing. These poor baby monkeys suffered a good deal for us to gain this knowledge. Thankfully, we don't have to repeat the experiments. Here we see a picture of what was actually happening. Dr. Harlow would take the baby monkey away from its mother very soon after birth, and he would replace the mother monkey with a dummy. And as you can see on the left, the dummy was a kind of reconstruction. It had a cloth covering, it had some comfort, it was warm, it was soft. The face was representational of a mother monkey. But later, the dummy mummy was replaced . The baby monkey would seek comfort from the cloth mother. Later, another dummy was introduced. This was a hardwired, much starker representation of the baby's mother, and it was from this dummy that the baby monkey was fed. So as you can see there, the baby monkey would take food from the hardwire mother, not getting close. You see the way it's feeding, it's quite sort of separate, it's not touching very much, it's just taking its food. And what was discovered was the monkey would only feed at this dummy, and then it returned to the cloth mother. The cloth mother was more important to the baby monkey, and this idea came up that the contact comfort the baby monkey received from the cloth mother was more important in establishing attachment. So what was the crucial factor in establishing that attachment for the baby monkey was not food, it was the comfort, the security, the reassurance it received, the physical contact it received from the cloth of the dummy mother. Now this is interesting, and if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the bottom of that, the foundation of that is physical needs. Food, water, sleep, and then the second stage is safety needs like shelter and so forth, And it's only when we get to the third level that love and belonging starts to play a part. Now, this is contradictory to what we've just seen, is that the primary need of the young monkey and young human babies, as we'll see later, is to make a contact, is to make a loving, caring contact. Now that makes sense because, baby monkeys can't go out and find their own food and their own water. They're vulnerable. The baby monkey needs to attach to an adult who is going to be able to provide those needs for it. And the attachment is one of care and reassurance. So if we look at this in terms of humans, attachment theory suggests that children come to the world pre-programmed with an innate need to attach in order to survive. So, human babies, they take an awful lot of care. They take a very long time to be able to learn the basics and look after themselves. They need to be able to attach to a human adult in order for those needs to be provided for. And the nature of that attachment is love and care. That's the kind of glue that holds the mother and baby together. So, just as a revision, all babies seek attachment. So human babies, all of us, every one of us, would seek attachment from the moment we're born. Comfort and security determine the attachment figure. It's the person who gives us the comfort and security, that's the person we're going to attach to, not necessarily the person we're going to receive food from. Very often it's the same person. And this attachment is very much an emotional experience. It's not based on the physical experience of being fed. It's based on a sense of comfort, reassurance, security and love. That's the determinant. That's what makes the attachment work. So let's look at some of the elements of Bowlby's theory. Bowlby's theory came out in a series of books over a couple of decades. The first book, Attachment, that's the Penguin edition there, came out in 1969. It had a major impact straight away. Second book, Separation, Volume 2, came out in 1972. And if you look at the quote there on the cover of the book, it says, "A turning point in the history of psychoanalysis and psychology generally." That's the Times Literary Supplement. That's quite impressive for a book on psychological theory to get that quote from the Times Literary Supplement. It gives you an idea of the extent and depth of impact this theory had on a number of professions. The final volume, Loss, came out in 1980. And you see there, loss, sadness and depression. So there's this link between the child's experience and the adult experience. The experiences we have as children in terms of making connections, attachments, being separated and losing attachments is going to shape how we deal with a number of quite profound emotional issues like happiness, love, sadness, depression, grief. All these adult emotions are predetermined by our childhood experience. So when we talk about the attachment figure, we're primarily talking about mother and baby. And this attachment goes both ways. Having spoken to my daughters, I have 3 daughters, all who have children, they will talk about the variation in which they made attachments to their newborn babies. A couple of times they've said that it took maybe a day or two to feel really connected to their baby. Other times that connection was immediate, instantaneous. But it goes both ways. The love and care, the wish to love and care from the mother and the need for love and care from the baby creates that bond. We could argue, and I think this is given a lot of recent research, that this attachment might even start during pregnancy. the baby in the womb is very aware of the mother's moods, the mother's experience, and it's picking up straight away. It's tuning into the mother's emotional state. Babies in the womb know when mother is stressed, know when she's tired, know when she's happy and excited. So that kind of interrelatedness between the mother and the baby starts very early on in pregnancy, arguably. And remember, what Bowlby said is this attachment figure determinant is not food. It's not who feeds the baby. It's who provides the care and the responsiveness. Who is looking after and responding and interacting with the baby. That's what the baby seeks. It seeks a connection, an attachment to the mother. So the child has this innate need to attach to one main attachment figure. So there's the primary attachment or the primary caregiver, and very often, vast majority of cases, this is going to be the mother. And this first attachment is very different from all other attachments. It has a different quality. This first attachment is laying down a blueprint of how the baby will expect other relationships to be. So the baby will be judging how it reacts with father or other relatives or siblings in the family by the way it's been dealt with by its mother. So if mother holds it, comforts it in a certain way, it's going to judge how the father holds and comforts the baby by that initial experience. The blueprint is laid down by the primary attachment figure. Okay, so this first attachment takes place at birth. Like with Lorenzo's ducklings, the imprinting takes place straight away, starts immediately the child is born. And what's interesting here is, and Bowlby had an impact on adoption policies, is that children who experience changes in their primary caregiver in the early months and years of their lives will suffer disruptions in their attachment. So if a baby has connected over a period of weeks or months to a caregiver, and then that caregiver changes, there's going to be a disruption and there's going to be a consequence. Now that consequence might be significant or it might be minor, but there will be a consequence. And I think adoption now takes the view that the earlier the better. And very often, if children have been decided that they're going to be adopted prior to their birth, then they will be taken immediately at birth to their adoptive parents in order to avoid any disruption in the attachment. That attachment happens very early and is significant, and even after a few weeks or months there could be a disruption in that if there's a shift in caregiver. Interestingly, twins' first attachment is to their twin rather than their mother. Now, we could do a whole lot of presentations on twins. I have had the pleasure to be the brother of twins. My younger brothers are twins, and I am the father of twins. I have identical twin daughters. So I've lived with twins all my life without actually being one. Twins are interesting. I remember a conversation with one of our daughters, my wife and I had. My daughter must have been about maybe 4 or 5, and somehow I got round to the notion where she said to us, "So you and mummy are not twins?" And we had to say, no, we're not twins. And she was quite upset and confused by this, because my daughter, being a twin, thought everybody had the advantage of having a twin. And she felt a little sorry for us, I think, that we weren't twins. So this first attachment with the twin is different. It's different for twins. So for the rest of us poor singletons who don't have the advantage of having a twin, the first attachment acts as a prototype. again, I think the first attachment for a twin is not necessarily their other twin, though I think there's a lot of interesting work that could be done about how their twin attachment is impacting on their attachment to their mother. But this internal model, this basic understanding of what relationships are with the first attachment, is going to set all future relationships, and not just intimate relationships with partners, but all social relationships. How you behave, how you talk, how you interact, how you know that you are being cared for, how you feel cared for, and what is care, is all going to be determined very largely, not exclusively, but very largely by that first attachment. So the internal model is being built up by the child over time through that first attachment. We have to say that after the first attachment, very quickly afterwards, the child is able to make secondary attachments, and that's going to be to father, siblings, grandparents, others. And those attachments can be very strong and powerful, but the first attachment is going to still maintain its prominence. So these secondary attachments will come along, and the baby can make up to 10 or more of these secondary attachments. So a wide range of people the baby can start to be making different sorts of relationships with different people in different ways. And any of you who are parents or grandparents will see this. I can certainly identify with my grandchildren that I have different relationships with my grandchildren, depending on the closeness, the amount of time I've spent with them, and the character and nature of the child, and the kind of relationship they have with their primary caregiver, their mothers. So secondary attachments come very quickly, and they will build upon that first attachment as the child starts to make relationships and understand what a relationship is and what care is. So this internal working model, this blueprint the child is building up over time through its relationship with its primary caregiver, this is going to determine the quality and type of care they will be able to give. So how the baby is shown care will be how the baby can show care. It's like what you're given will be what you can give, what you can pass on. The type of care. It shapes that what care actually means and what care represents. How do I show love to you? I do this certain thing because this certain thing was done to me also. Okay, so the child's learning is based on how they're handled and how the caregiver acts towards them. Again, it's not what the caregiver says. There's that saying, isn't it? Don't do what I say, do what I do. That's what it should be. Often it's do what I say and don't do what I do. How the baby's handled. The baby doesn't have language at the beginning. The thing they respond to very powerfully is touch, holding, face-to-face contact, a sense of safety and security. These are the factors that are building the relationship and building the love between the mother and the child. Language is going to come much later. Language is going to play a part up to about a year onwards. Okay, so we're going to look at types of attachment. So attachments can be negative, perverse and dysfunctional, as well as nurturing and caring. The baby is taking whatever it's given. And in some extreme cases where the mother is not able to give love or has her own profound difficulties, then whatever she is giving the baby is what the baby is picking up. And sometimes that can be difficult, it can be negative, it can be ignoring and so forth. And the quality and style of the care the child receives will determine their understanding of what love and care should be. As we said, it's building a blueprint of what love is. So whatever the baby gets, that's what it understands love and care to be. Now, as the baby grows up, and particularly as it grows up into adolescence, there's a kind of adjustment made, as the baby is able to experience much more of the world and get more checks and examples of how love and care can be, then the child makes an adjustment on this. I've had a couple of clients, female clients, who have been particularly good mothers who did not have good mothers themselves. They weren't given maybe the best care and loving when they were children, yet they were able to do it for their own children. And I've asked them both, how was it that you were able to do that? And they both gave me the same answer. They said, well, it was easy. I just did the opposite to what my mother did. So they learned through the negative. As they grew older, they realised that the love and care that they got from their mothers wasn't always correct. And therefore they did the opposite to what they got in order to be good mothers and to provide for their own children. So deficiencies in care will often be understood by the child as the fault of the child. This comes up a great deal in psychotherapy. The fact that the child may not have been properly or fully loved is made sense of by the child by saying, maybe I wasn't good enough. I couldn't have been worthy of love. I wasn't nice enough to my parents. I wasn't worthy of being properly loved. So the child understands any deficiency as a fault of itself first. And it takes quite a lot of maturity and sophisticated psychological thinking to understand that maybe the fault lies with what I was given, not with me. Because the first assumption is from many people is that if it's not right, then it's my problem. Okay, again, let's look at applications of this. So the child is not able to make quality judgment about its care. Whatever it gets, it's going to accept. Whatever it receives, it's going to see as correct. And it will accept the care that it's given. There's a joke I heard many years ago when I was training as a therapist that kind of illustrates this a little bit. And the joke goes along the lines of a married couple on their first weekend together. The wife decides, I'll make a Sunday dinner. I'll do a nice dinner for us both. And the husband goes, great. So she makes a beautiful dinner, lovely dinner, presents it. They sit down, they eat, and she says, well, what did you think? Did you enjoy that? And the husband goes, that was lovely. It was lovely. But do you know what? The gravy just wasn't the way Mother used to make it. And the wife goes, okay, fine, fine. The next week she thinks, I'll try something different. I'll make the gravy differently. And so she sits down again and says, did you enjoy the meal? And he goes, it was very nice. But the gravy just wasn't the way Mother used to make it. And she goes, oh, okay. And this goes on, and she keeps trying, and she tries different recipes, she tries different ways of making the gravy. And she's getting a bit bored with this. And then one day she just burns the gravy, just ruins it, can't be bothered, presents the dinner, sits down with her husband. He eats the dinner. She says, what did you think? And he goes, at last, the gravy is just the way Mother used to make it. So the idea is what we get given is what we think is right, what we think is care. Even though it may be unpleasant or not quite right or deficient or not the best, the baby can't make those quality judgments. But the child will feel gaps or failures to provide for them as painful experience. That's not to say that if a mother is not able to be present enough and the baby gets left crying because it's hungry or because it needs its nappy changed or because it's frightened, if the mother is not able to be there at those times when she's really needed to be, the baby is still going to feel painful, difficult experiences. It's not going to accept that as acceptable. It may not understand what's happening, but it's still going to suffer for the lack of care that the mother provides, for the gaps or failures in the attachment. But it will assume that those failures, often it will assume those failures to be its own fault later in life when it's trying to make sense of that. So as the child grows, these failings in care will often be assumed to be the fault of the child rather than the caregiver. Okay, let's have a look, because babies are very demanding little creatures. And if you've ever had the experience of being a mother or speak to a mother, you will be very aware of this. Babies are not just physically demanding, they are emotionally, psychologically demanding little creatures. So the mother has to act as an auxiliary ego for the baby. So she needs to have sufficient ego strength both for herself and the baby. So what do we mean by ego strength? So ego strength is the means by which we manage our emotions. Often this word gets misused when we talk about inflated egos or people with big egos. What ego is the organised, rational, conscious part of our minds from which we work out how to do things. It's what I'm using as I'm speaking to you. It's what you're using as you listen to this video. It's the organised, rational part of our minds. Now, there's other parts of our minds, the unconscious, which isn't so organised. There's another part which we call the superego, which is judgmental. But the ego is the bit from which we work on. It's the bit we need and we need to develop, because it's the bit that means we can function. So it determines how well we cope with anxiety, depression, disappointment, sadness, also excitement, pleasure and orderliness. The ego is basically determining how we cope with everything. It's managing our emotional experience. And our emotional experience is pretty full, isn't it? Even when we're sitting still doing nothing. There's a lot going on inside our heads if we listen to it. There's a lot of feelings and thoughts and memories and recollections and wonderings going on. And it's our ego that has to manage and cope with all these conflicting experiences within our minds. So it's the ability to maintain an emotional balance and resilience within oneself. So the stronger one's ego is, the more able we are to cope with the emotional trauma or the emotional difficulties in life. Now, babies don't have any ego really. They have possibly no ego at all, because they're tiny little creatures of emotion. They work out of a pure impulse. The baby's hungry, it cries. The baby's frightened, it cries. The baby's uncomfortable, it cries. The baby's not sure what's going on, it cries. It has a very basic response to everything, because it doesn't have the benefit of experience from which to learn. So the baby has no ego strength and cannot regulate their emotions. Babies just cry, babies just react. They're not able to make sense of their own experience. So their inner life is a chaotic world of sensations, and they're struggling to find meaning. And the amazing thing is that as the baby grows, it starts to build meaning. It starts to build experiences which it connects together, and it starts to work out that this sensation means I'm hungry, and this sensation means I'm frightened. And when mummy comes, I don't feel frightened. And when the bottle comes or the breast comes, I don't feel frightened. So it starts to make sense of this world of chaotic emotions. And the mother needs to help it in this process of making sense. So with the mother's care, the child is able to distinguish individual sensations into feelings of good and bad. This is something that's okay. I might feel a bit uncomfortable, but that's okay. That's not going to be a danger. But if there's a really loud bang right next to me, then that's something to pay attention. That might be something bad, and I need to be really wary of that. So the mother, through her ego strength, is able to build the baby's ego strength, and so the baby's able to make sense of a whole world of sensations. Okay, so helping the child regulate their emotions and avoid feeling overwhelmed by negative feelings. Because if the mother's ego strength isn't sufficiently strong, then the baby's own confusion and melee of feelings is going to overwhelm it. And the baby is going to be upset, irritable, confused, fractious, because it's not finding any comfort or reassurance from the mother, because the mother can't find that comfort and reassurance within herself. This is a very good argument, the need to give support to mothers, because the stress and anguish of being a mother will deplete the mother's ego strength. Now these events are going to be conveyed through holding and face-to-face contact. If you've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to take a baby and to stare at them and to talk to them and look at them, you can see how quickly and how readily they respond to you. You know, they will look into your eyes and they will respond immediately. That they're looking for connection. They're looking for something which is conveyed through face-to-face contact. And language, children really learn language best through face-to-face contact. It also works with Labradors. If you've got a Labrador or a Spaniel, a well-trained dog, when they want to know what to do, they look you straight in the eyes and wait for the command. So it's similar with dogs. So let's have a look at applications. Okay, so mothers need emotional support to care for themselves, to build a good attachment with their babies. Because if the mother's ego strength is depleted, or the mother's ego strength isn't there in the first place, then the attachment is going to be severely limited and restricted. So we all know that mothers need a great deal of support. They need support from partners, from extended family, from friends. That's vital that mothers are given that, because the job of mothering, the job of being the primary attachment figure, is exhausting. Mothers who have not had good positive attachment themselves will struggle to provide that for their babies. So we get this chain effect. If the mother has not had that experience of having a positive attachment with their primary caregiver, they're going to really struggle to give it to their babies. And emotional contact with the baby is conveyed through holding and face-to-face contact. And that conscious holding of the baby and interacting with the baby, responding to the baby. If the baby smiles, you smile back. If the baby laughs, you laugh with them. Or you might try and instigate a laugh by smiling and laughing and get the baby to smile and laugh. And the security the baby is getting from that holding, that physical holding. And we all appreciate that. I mean, you know, there's not many people in the world that don't appreciate some form of physical contact. Even if it's shaking hands or giving hugs, we get a lot of emotional support through that physical contact as adults. Now, we're going to look at measuring attachment. So we're going to take a look at Mary Ainsworth and the Strange Situation Experiment. Sounds ominous, but it's fairly safe. Okay, so there's a Strange Situation Experiment. You can see from the picture, here is a room. It has some toys, some pictures, a couple of chairs, and we're seeing it through a two-way mirror. So what's going to happen in the room is going to be filmed, recorded, observed, but the baby and the mother can't see what's going on. So here we have a mother with its baby, around about 18 months old. Could be a little younger, could be a little older. And the baby is taken into the room with its mother. So the mother and child enter the room and they have a play. They look at the toys, they start to interact, they might chat on, they may look at the pictures on the wall, so forth. And all the events are going to be recorded through a two-way mirror. Okay, so the mother plays and engages with the child for a while. Then the mother leaves the room. So the mother has to go, shut the door, and leave the baby in the room by themselves. Now this is only for a very short time. It might literally be for a matter of seconds. Now what's going to happen? Now I think it's pretty safe to assume that the baby's going to be upset and the baby's going to cry. That's going to be, in a way, you want the baby to cry. It sounds awful, doesn't it? But you want the baby to miss the mother. Now, what happens next is the mother goes straight back in the room. So it's the child's reaction to the mother's return which is being observed. That's the bit that's really being measured. When the mother returns to the room, often immediately, as I say, it might only be a few seconds, this is the indicator of the attachment style. How the child is going to react to the mother's return. Because, you know, what the mother's done is abandoned the child. You know, the child thought we were having a nice time and then mother just walks off. And the child is going to be upset. But how does the child reconnect with the mother? That's what's being observed, and that's what's being tested. Now, there's a slight variation on this experiment where there would be a stranger in the room. So the mother and child would go into the room, and there would be a stranger sitting in a chair, not interacting with the child or the mother, and then the mother would leave the baby with the stranger, and the stranger would try and interact with the baby. There's a slight variation of this, but we'll stick to this basic type of the experiment to illustrate the point. So the mother's returned, and it's how the baby reacts next that's crucial. So let's look at the different, here's a picture of Mary Ainsworth with a baby and with a mother. Let's look at what happens next. So the child is going to be upset, and it's the rate and way in which the child recovers from the separation that is observed. So we're seeing how does the child recover from this loss of mother. So these reactions, they fall into three general categories. Well, you could argue four. We're going to look at that. Yeah. But there's going to be a range of reactions, but they fall into three general categories. And the first one is what is called the secure child. So the child is going to be upset when the mother goes, because that's what you want. You don't want the mother to be indifferent to the mother going, because there's an attachment. So the child is distressed when the mother leaves, but when she comes back, the mother greets her. The baby is happy to see mother back. She greets her and wants her to return. And often then the baby will reconnect with the surroundings in the room. It will say, well, great, mother's back, I'm happy, everything's okay again, and we can carry on playing, we can carry on looking at the pictures, we can carry on playing with the toys. So this quite quick recovery rate and acceptance and pleasure to see the mother is what was called the secure child, a secure attachment. In a sense, all's well. The bumps in the road, the separations can be recovered from quickly. It's rather like a runner. If a runner was to run a mile, they might take, 10 seconds to recover. If I was to run a mile, I'd probably take 10 hours to recover, because my recovery rate is going to be a lot slower because I'm not fit and I'm not a runner. So it's recovery rates. A secure child can recover quickly from the trauma of being separated from its mother. Now the next one is what's called the avoidant child. So when the mother returns to the room, the child does not particularly want to see the mother. So what the child does is says, well, you've left me and I'm not interested in you anymore. You've left me and I'm just going to carry on playing with the toys. So they will focus on the environment. They will look at the room, the toys, and they will ignore mother, because they're avoiding mother. Because maybe this has happened too many times, that mother's gone and left them too many times and they've not known when she's coming back. So they've got, the attachment is of an avoidant nature, where the child will just say, well, I'm going to pretend you didn't come and you didn't go, and I'm just going to make out like everything's fine. So the child is avoiding the emotional trauma of the separation. The other one, and this sometimes is split into two bits, ambivalent and resistant, and we'll look a bit about that later, but if we put them together for the moment. So it's the ambivalent resistant child. So the child is very upset when mother goes, and it becomes totally uninterested in the environment on a return. So the child has lost interest in everything. It doesn't particularly want to see the mother. It doesn't particularly want to play with the toys. It's ambivalent about the mother's return. The mother's come back, but I love you, but you've left me anyway, and I'm mad with you, and I'm upset with you, and I don't really want to give you a hug, and I don't really want to play with the toys anymore because everything's spoilt because you left me, and that's a really bad thing, and I can't forgive you. So the child becomes ambivalent in the sense of it's not sure whether it's happy to see mother or not, because it's mad with mother as well as happy to see her, and it's disorganized because it can't focus on anything else. With the previous one, the child could still focus on playing, playing could still be something that it would engage with. But with the ambivalent resistant child, it can't concentrate on the toys. Okay, so let's look at this in this diagrammatical form. So we've got the primary caregiver. We've got the child's working model. The child, over a period of time, remember this experiment was done on 18-month-old children. So an attachment has already been very well established and developed for 18 months of the child's life. So something has already been put into place. Now, it's not to say it might change in later, but we measure it at a given point in time. So the 18-month-year-old has got an internal working model, and it splits off into these different categories. So if there's more positive loved holding, the child is going to be more secure. Remember, these are gradations. You know, you might get, there's grey areas in between all these areas. We're making kind of hard generalizations, and this is really a scale. So there'll be lots of variations in between these parameters. And the unloved or possibly rejected child, the child that doesn't get as much love or has been rejected, is going to be avoidant. I'm going to avoid you because, you know, you can be quite problematic. You can make me feel quite unloved, and I don't feel happy with you. So I'm just going to be careful in the way I interact with you. And then you get the angry and confused, the resistant child, which is, I don't want you to love me, I do want you to love me, because loving you is painful because you keep going away, and so forth. So this gives you a general idea of the different attachment styles, and these attachment styles are very useful in looking at how adults interact, because we get very angry and confused adults, we get very avoidant adults, we get very secure adults, and very often it's secure adults can have as many problems as the other two, because secure adults will often be very puzzled and confused by other people who aren't secure, and they cannot make sense of their relationships with people who might be avoidant or resistant. They really struggle and can't work out why they can't have the type of relationship that they're used to. So being secure isn't a guarantee of not having problems. In some ways it creates as many problems as it solves. You may be secure within yourself, but when you come to meeting other people in the world, you're going to have to meet people and they're not going to make much sense to you. Okay, so these childhood attachment styles continue into adult traits, and let's look at the adult consequences of these. So let's look at the secure childhood attachment. So that's distressed when mother leaves, but greets and is happy to see mother on her return. So it's a quick recovery rate. So if we look at adult attachment, secure, so generally comfortable in relationships. So it's able to make and break relationships happily. You know, make friends, see friends, you know, interact with people on a very comfortable level. As I said, they might have difficulties in making sense of people who aren't secure. And they're able to seek care and support in relationships. This is a really key factor. When you feel needy, when you feel like you need support, you've got to be able to go and get it and accept it. So secure people will know where to go to get the comfort they need. That's a very useful skill, isn't it? It's like knowing where Sainsbury's is when you're hungry. You know, if you don't know where to get food when you're hungry, that's a problem. So secure people will accept that they can go out and find comfort from certain places, and that comfort will make them feel better. So when they feel low, they've got the remedy, they've got the cure to help them. Okay, let's look at avoidant childhood attachment. So this is the child that does not look for mother in return. It's avoiding mother, it's avoiding the sense of loss, it's avoiding the emotion of anger towards her that she's returned. It's switching off those emotions, but gives their attention to the environment, focuses on the thing that they have control over. So the toys, well, I can manipulate the toys. Nobody's taking the toys away from me, so I'm going to focus on those toys. So in adult, this can be quite a dismissing sort of person that can disregard and cut people off and be quite brutal at times, maybe. And for a secure person, that would be very painful, and they would struggle to understand why somebody's behaving in a dismissing manner. So they have a strong sense of autonomy. They want to be able to resolve problems from within their own understanding, from within their own emotional sphere. They're not seeking outside of themselves. They're trying to work it out from within themselves. That's not just practical problems, but emotional problems. So they can cut themselves off emotionally in relationships. They can be quite suddenly they can be there, and suddenly they can be gone, and that can be quite difficult. Okay, let's look at the ambivalent, resistant, and sometimes disorganized. So we've got kind of another word to describe this group. So they are very upset when mother leaves. So they are not avoiding the emotional content of what's going on. They are experiencing the emotions of being abandoned. But they lose interest in everything. They don't just feel the emotional impact of losing mother, they feel the emotional loss of everything. So anything around them that might have been exciting or interesting has suddenly lost all its value, all its importance. So these often will be preoccupied people. Okay, they're fearful of rejection in relationships. They're very sensitive to rejection. They're very sensitive to what the other person's feeling. They are expecting and anticipating rejection. It's not when you leave me. It's not if you leave me, rather, it's when you leave me. So they're desperate to maintain closeness in relationships. They can be quite clingy, quite demanding, quite high maintenance, because every little bit of good they get while they're getting it is precious, because their assumption is get it while it's there, because it's not going to be there for long. And I think, if we look around our friends and family, we might see people like all these. We probably come across them at some point. People who are very needy, very demanding, and the slightest rejection can be interpreted as an enormous rejection. If you say, I'm sorry, I can't come round tonight, they see that as the end of the friendship or something. So can be inconsistent with showing emotions. So they can be anticipating. They can be saying, well, you're only saying that because you mean X, Y, and Z. They're anticipating the loss before it's happened. Okay, let's have a look at, these are the estimates of attachment styles in the population. So what percentage of us are in these three groups? Now, this is very much an estimate. So we've kind of, as you see, we've split off the third group into two groups. Now, I wouldn't put a huge amount of weight on these figures, because it's impossible to go around to everybody in the country and find out their attachment style. But this is based on people who have been in therapy or been in treatment. So secure attachments is estimated to be around 55 to 65% of the population. Now, my gut reaction, and it's purely my own gut reaction, would be that it's much lower than that. But that's just my pessimism, maybe. So avoidant attachment, it's around 20 to 30%. Ambivalent and disorganized, although these have been separated about here, the ambivalent one is not necessarily disorganized, and the disorganized one is not primarily ambivalent. It is 5 to 15 and 20 to 40%. So it's an interesting view of what might be going on in the population, but it's very much a guess, But it can provoke some thought about yourself, your family, your friends. Where might they all be in this? Where do they lean? And remember, it's a scale. It's not necessarily, not definitely one or the other. You might have elements of both. In certain situations, you might be pretty secure. In other situations, you might be more avoidant or possibly disorganized. So, applications. So this awareness of attachment styles brings insight in how to manage relationships. If you've got an idea of how you work emotionally, if you know that you have some insecurities, that's going to help you when you make relationships. And if you know the other person's attachment style, that's going to help you make sense of what's going on between two people. And what goes on between two people can be highly complicated and highly confusing, because there's so many variables in the emotions that exist between two people in a relationship. So this knowledge of the attachment style brings a great deal of insight in how to manage these relationships. Okay, so we're going to look at what are the key components of attachment theory, and this is going to be quite a long section. Let's go through it then. So there are 4 key characteristics to Bowlby's attachment theory. First of all is the idea of the safe haven. It's pretty straightforward. The secure base, secure emotional support. That's quite complicated, and we're going to look at that in detail. There's proximity maintenance, which again is fairly straightforward in having people physically close and physically available, closely available. And then we're going to look at separation distress. Again, that's quite a complex area, and that's going to take a little bit more time to look at. So we're going to go through these 4 areas, these 4 characteristics. So let's look first then at the idea of the safe haven. So this is a secure, loving environment that a child can rely on and return to. Now, it need not be geographical. It's about people in a safe place. But it does need to be constant and dependable. Well, what are we describing? A home. The idea that it need not be geographical, I think geography helps. Having spoken to clients who have grown up in forces families, who have moved around many times in their childhood, and I've heard many stories of adults saying they went to 7 different schools or 6 different schools, or I think the most I heard was about 9 different schools throughout their childhood, because their parents were moving around with their postings. That is a problem, and that does cause its own difficulties. But if you're taking with you people and love and security, and you're setting up that secure haven in different locations, that need not be so much of a problem. But often people who move around are often disorganized as well, and that disjointedness in geography is also portrayed in the environment and the home and the type of home. So it's a secure, loving environment. It's somewhere where you can relax. Now, this is no surprise to us adults. We all need a quiet, peaceful place. Isn't that just wonderful? We need that. We need a room, or maybe it's our whole home, if we're lucky enough to make it our whole home. Somewhere where we can feel calm and we can know is secure and peaceful. So this is essential to the baby, to the child, to the teenager, to the adult. It doesn't change. But if you think about the small baby and the attachment, the mother needs to be in a calm, safe environment. And mothers will also often talk about sort of nesting or preparing, and they like to prepare everything. They like to get that safe haven properly organised, having a crib, or having a cot, or having a room, or having it decorated, and having everything ready and prepared, so that when the baby comes into the world, there's a safe place for it to be. So this is crucial. Pretty basic, but it's a very crucial thing. And without it, the babies will be constantly pulled from here to there. It can't settle, it can't focus. The whole attachment is being disrupted by external factors. We're going to talk about the secure base. This is quite a complicated idea. So let's start with the beginning. So secure emotional support within the family structure. So it contains a number of different elements, but it's a secure base, enables a child to explore the world. So this is where learning comes in. Effective learning is enabled by this secure base. So it's true of the baby. If it's got this secure base, the baby can start to develop its understanding. And again, it's true of the baby, the child, the teenager, the adult. If you've got a calm, safe environment where everything is in order and things are predictable and knowable, then you can learn, because you cannot learn in a disorganized place. There's lots of talk about education and how children best learn. It's not so much about how much money their parents have, it's very much about how stable their homes are. Children will learn in a stable home. They don't need lots of money to learn, but they do need a stable environment from which to learn. Okay, so let's look at these different elements. So the secure base model has 5 key factors, and the quality and strength of each of these factors is going to be determined by the parental care and the individual attachment style. So the attachment style is being shaped by the secure base, but the attachment style will determine the different factors as well and how important they each are. So the first of these factors within the secure base is availability, time with the child, and this will help the child to trust. So the more time you can give the child, the more they can trust. Not just quality of time. Quality is important, but time with the child. And if we think about what we do with new babies and their mothers, is we give them time. We give mothers time off work. We give them quite a long time. We give them up to a year off work in order to be with the baby, because that time is important. That those early years, that one-to-one interaction, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as exhausting as it is for the poor mothers, is vital for the baby. Having time. Again, this applies right through. And if we think about friendships, our friendships will be built with time. We've got to have time with our friends in order to build the friendship. So family membership. So introducing others, helping the child to belong. Allowing the child to have a sense of its place. And this comes up quite importantly. You know, first babies know that they have a mummy and a daddy. There's mummy, daddy and baby. That's their place. They have a belonging. And then maybe along comes the second child. And then something shifts, because the baby has got to realise that there's a mummy and a daddy, and there's me and there's another baby. But I'm the older one. I'm the big brother. I'm the big sister. And so this idea of the place in the family, and that being an acceptable and good place. It's important that you're a big brother, because your little sister needs you to look after her, and you'll always be mummy and daddy's big boy. You'll always be the first, and so on. This help of having a place and membership to the family, some ownership within the structure. Sensitivity, showing empathy. It goes back to the idea of mothers and ego strength. With ego strength, the mother can show empathy. It can pick up and sense what the baby is feeling, and the baby can sense that the mother is feeling what it feels. There's a harmony, a synchronicity of feeling between the mother and the child. And so this sensitivity is crucial, in that if I feel sad, Daddy knows that I feel sad. And if I've fallen over and I've hurt my knee, Mummy knows that I'm hurting. So this helps the child manage feelings and behaviour. Often notice, if you probably notice it yourself, is a young child may fall over for the first time, or fall over and they just may scrape their knee, just done, just a minor damage to themselves, but they get very upset. They get very tearful, and they rush to their parent, and they're often in a state of absolute floods of tears. And what the parent does is to show an empathy and say, yes, you must have hurt yourself. I can see that you've grazed your knee, but you know what? It's okay. We can fix this. It's not a big problem. I can just wash it and we put a plaster on it and you'll be fine. So The parent is giving empathy and sensitivity to the child. Yes, it did hurt, but it's okay, it's not that bad, and we can fix it. So this is helping the child understand how we manage feelings, that falling over isn't going to kill him, that falling over is something that we can deal with quite simply. And on the other side of that coin, in crossing roads, we have to say to children, this is a really dangerous thing to do. You have to be very aware of this and very conscious of this, because this is something which on the surface doesn't look like much. We're just walking across a road, but there's cars and there's traffic and there's danger. So we have to help the child understand that there's a different way of managing that problem and a different way of feeling about it. And we do that by empathy. We do that by helping the child understand what we feel and what they feel. The next one is cooperation. So shared tasks. Helping the child to feel effective and be cooperative. I always think of a friend of mine who's now in his 50s, and he was the youngest child of about five, I think of 5 children, 5 siblings, and he was the youngest by a good few years. And of course, being the youngest, he kind of got left behind, and everybody's doing things, and he's still the little one. But his mother used to get him to make the instant whip. I don't know if you remember instant whip. It was a packet of dessert, a powder that you poured into a bowl, and you poured some milk and you whisked it up, and it kind of set like a blancmange. There was your dessert. But his mother used to make a big thing about, well, Stuart, you're going to make the instant whip. And so she would get him to make it, and she would say, you're the best person at making instant whip. And he felt very proud that he could make the pudding for the whole family. He could participate and achieve a task, even though he was only a little boy. And he talked about this into his 40s and 50s, still quite proud of his instant whip cooking abilities. But that gave him, and that gives a child, a sense of being able to achieve things, and also to cooperate. So he's cooperating in the process of making the meal. And again, with cooperation in terms of doing things together. So helping mummy do the washing up, helping daddy tidy up, helping with the hoovering, whatever it may be. So this sense of cooperation and interacting with another human being in a shared task is key. It's called teamwork, and a great many businesses are highly dependent on effective teamwork. So this is where teamwork begins right at the beginning with the attachment with the parent, the mother. So the next one is acceptance. So identifying good qualities, building the child's self-esteem. If there's one factor that comes up time and time again in certainly my psychotherapy practice, is low self-esteem. People who are actually very competent but have no sense of their competency. They assume that they are not good enough. So this idea of saying, this is what you're good at, and this is how good you are at it, giving them a proportion and a scale of their ability, is essential in building that self-esteem. It can go the other way, and I think if a child is told it's good at everything all of the time, regardless, then it can become difficult in the sense that the child thinks it can do anything at the drop of a hat, and that can be as much a problem as low self-esteem. So the child has to be told when it does a good job, how it did a good job, why it did a good job, and how to do a better job. So this is crucial, acceptance. So if we put these 5 bits together, we get a base. If you imagine we're looking down upon a building, it's like these are the columns that are going to hold up the structure of the building. This is why it means called the secure base. It's the base foundation for the child to grow from. Availability, helping the child to trust. Sensitivity, helping the child to manage feelings and behaviour. Acceptance, building the child's self-esteem. Cooperation, helping the child to feel effective and be cooperative. Family membership, helping the child to belong. And you see how each are interrelated. So cooperation is going to link in with sensitivity, and sensitivity is going to link into availability. If you're available, you're able to be sensitive. If you're available, you're able to find acceptance. If you're cooperative, then you're going to be part of the family membership. So these 5 interact. Each interacts with the other in a crucial way to build the secure base. And if there's one book to read by John Bowlby, it's The Secure Base. It's a short book, and it's a great introduction to get into his work. So if there's one book to look at, take a look at that one. Okay, so we're going to look at the second factor here, which is it's the third factor, proximity maintenance. Okay, so physical contact, cuddles and hugs and holding. So small babies will need skin-to-skin contact in order to feel secure. And much of that will take place during feedings, particularly during breastfeeding. I've got a year-old granddaughter, and she was breastfed for, I think, 9 months. Can't remember exactly. But if I'm holding her, and I'm just holding her arms like this, and she's feeling sleepy and she feels like she wants a bit of security, what she does is she puts her hand down the front. She wants to feel my skin. She wants to get past the clothes and just hold on to my skin. She wants that skin-to-skin contact to feel secure, because that's very important to babies. That warmth, softness of another human body provides the security. And my goodness, as adults, we kind of want some of that as well too. That skin-to-skin contact is very important for our mental health and for our psychological needs. So security for the baby is coming through cuddles, holding, hugging, comfort. Doesn't change, does it? Doesn't change. It's crucial for the baby, unless of course the baby didn't get very much of that. And there are some adults that find physical proximity quite difficult, and these are almost certainly babies who didn't get it as children, who didn't get a great deal of physical contact or minimal physical contact as children. So they got used to the lack of physical contact. So as adults, they don't find it particularly comfortable or comforting. They kind of have missed out on that in some way. So proximity maintenance is consistency and availability are important for the child to trust the contact. So also the contact needs to be appropriate for the child's comfort. Some parents can be too much for their children and demanding of their children's physical contact, wanting the child when maybe the child doesn't particularly want them, or wanting them too much. So needy parents can also be a problem. I want to keep cuddling my baby, I want to keep cuddling my toddler, when the baby really doesn't need it. It needs a lot of it, but it doesn't need it all the time, or it doesn't need it necessarily when the parent needs it. So it's got to be appropriate contact and really kind of led by the child. Some children say, "Get off me, I want to play," or whatever. Okay, well, that's fine. They're fine, they're comfortable. They don't really need you to be smothering them at that moment. But consistency and availability. So it's always on demand. It's always available. And little children and toddlers will very often need to run to their parents and give them a cuddle at all sorts of times. They may just feel suddenly, a bit lonely. They may be playing, they may be happy. They run to give their parents a cuddle. They may be coming from school or something's happened and they need that proximity. And often words aren't exchanged. It's cuddles. It's an emotional experience. They just come, want to give you a cuddle, and then off they go again. They receive what they need. So that consistency of always being able to be there. When do cuddles stop? At what stage do you stop cuddling your child? Well, never. My mum's 92. She still cuddles me. So it doesn't ever stop. It's always available. Okay, right. Let's look at the next one, which is going to be a long one because there's a lot to this. Separation distress. So up until the 1960s, this is a measure of separation distress. Children who need to go to hospital would often not be allowed visits from their parents. This did change. Bowlby's work really did change this practice. many of you may not know this or remember it, but it was true that if a child had to go into hospital, maybe for an operation, hospitals kept you in a lot longer then than they do now. So if you had to have your appendix out or your tonsils out, you might be in a hospital for a week or more, just to have some operations now, which they will do in a day. I remember a client telling me quite extensively in detail the story of his experience. So he had to go into hospital. I can't remember what it was for, but it wasn't major. It was a fairly minor operation. But he was going to be in hospital for 2 weeks. And this would have been in the mid-1960s. So he was taken by his parents to the doorway of the hospital with his little suitcase. And the matron came up, took the suitcase from the parents and said, "Goodbye, see you in 2 weeks' time." And the parents left. And there was no visiting whatsoever. I mean, there was in some hospitals some form of visiting, which was quite strictly regulated. You might be able to pop in to see your child for an hour in the afternoon or something, but visiting was very strictly controlled. Now, the reason this was done was because it was felt best for the child. It was felt the child would get too distressed if the mother was there, or if the parents were there, if the mother was coming and going, that this would cause more problems than it solved. So the hospital is much preferred, it's much neater, it's much tidier, just not to have parents on the wards. We have enough to do with the children. So that was the thinking. Of course, the problem was that children are being abandoned to a strange, scary place where scary things are going to be done to them. They've no idea what's going to happen. They might have general anaesthetics, they might be in pain, they might need painful medication, they might need painful treatment, they're going to be treated by strangers. It was a traumatic experience for children to be left alone in hospital. And Bowlby's work changed this. And this is where we have the situation now where if you have the unfortunate situation where your child's going to be in hospital, you will be able to stay with your child. You'll be able to sleep with them. You'll be able to stay with them 24 hours. And that really does come from attachment theory and the importance of the maintenance, the proximity maintenance, the fact that parents need to be around all the time to help the child through what is a difficult, complex experience of being in hospital. So, the first 2 years of attachment are key. Any disruption in attachment can cause long-term, irreversible damage. Now, this sounds pretty drastic, and it kind of is. I think that the one kind of hope here is that what can be damaged, and some of it can be irreversible, some of it can be made up for. In later life, these kind of deficiencies can be made up. But I have certainly worked with a number of adults who have suffered disruptions in attachment early on, and it is extremely difficult for them to adjust. It does something quite fundamental to their psyche, to their understanding. And these are intelligent, sensible, clever people, but because of what's happened to them in childhood was too severe or too much for them to cope at the time, the repercussions will remain with them for their whole life, and the repercussions on their relationships. Now, Bowlby called this the maternal deprivation hypothesis, is that when children suffer this disruption attachment, now when we're talking about disruptions, we just mentioned hospital visits, which might only be a few weeks, but we're also talking about long-term disruptions where it could be months or potentially years, or the nature of the disruption could be severe. I worked at the same time with two clients, and they were very, very different clients, both women. One was in her 20s, who was a very, very smart, very bright, very switched on young woman. The other one was a woman of 50s, who interestingly had been a porn star in her youth. A very different sort of woman, clever, very pleasant woman, but from very different kinds of backgrounds. But as I was working with them, these two women, I connected them in my brain somehow. They came as a pair, although they didn't see each other, completely saw them in different places. They never knew about each other. But in my brain somehow they got connected. And I talked to them both about their family histories, and I discovered that both these women had lost their mothers. Their mothers had died at the age of 3. And I thought this was astounding, that there was something about them, as different as they were, that was familiar. And the familiarity was both these women had suffered the loss of their mothers at the age of 3. Now, this wasn't mother's gone away for a bit. This is mother who had passed away, was dead, and was never going to return. And the trauma that had caused for these two women was similar, even though their whole life experiences were very different. So this early disruption in attachment has major impacts. So let's look at short-term separation from attachment figures. This can lead to 3 main areas: protest, despair, and detachment. So let's go through these 3 areas and look at them in a little bit more detail. So the first one, and this does mirror the stages of grief, the stages of bereavement. There's a kind of similarity between this and that process. So if a child is separated suddenly or without reason, or for maybe for whatever reason, the initial reaction is protest. The baby is going to cry if it's separated from its parents. It's going to scream, it's going to want to cling to, it's want to avoid the separation. And I think, we often see this. First days at school, I think that's a big one. I think that's, again, Bowlby's theory has had an impact on the way teachers deal with this problem, and the phasing in, mothers will stay with their children so that the child gets over this disruption of attachment, having to spend a few hours at school. But I certainly remember when one of the few things I do remember about my early childhood was my first day at school, and I managed pretty well, but there were some kids around me pretty upset about it because we had to spend all day long at school from our mums, and it was a bit of a shock. So this screaming, protesting at the separation is the first stage. The second one is despair. So if this separation goes on too long and there's not any compensation, and going back to my image of the first day at school, the teachers were pretty nice and they gave us some fun things to do. So we start to feel there's a bit of compensation for being separated. But if there's no compensation and the separation continues too long, the child will fall into despair. So the protesting stops and they start to appear calm, but they're upset and refuses comfort. So if I can't get my mother, I don't want anybody else to comfort me. And it's going back to the avoidant. Remember the avoidant child? It goes back to the withdrawal and uninterested. The child doesn't want to know about anything. It's withdrawing not just from the loss of the mother, but from everything around it. It's not going to learn. It's not going to be interested. And if you can see that this is kind of the root of depression. I've lost the thing I want. I'm helpless. I can't get it back. I'm powerless to get it back. Of course, the baby can't get the mother. The mother's got to come to the baby. The baby doesn't know how to overcome that problem. It gives up. It appears calm, like a depression, which can be very calm outwardly, but it's a complete internal collapse. The third stage is detachment. So when the separation continues, the child will start to engage in other people. If mother's not going to return, then I'm going to have to find an alternative. And then if the mother returns, then that initial caregiver will be rejected. It's too late. You've been away for too long, and now you come back, and the caregiver will be shown anger. And then that might happen, going back to my first day at school, is that when I went to school in the 1950s, mothers would be away for 5 hours and they would come back on the end of the first day, and I would imagine some of the kids were saying, well, you left me here, why are you coming back now? The other interesting was that a friend of mine relates a story about their child went to school for the first day, came home and said, that was wonderful. I enjoyed that, but I don't want to have to do it again. Not realising that school was more than one day. So this detachment, I got used to it. I've overcome the trauma of the separation. The protest didn't work. I despaired, and now I have to seek something else. I have to find somewhere else to give me some kind of comfort. This is a picture of orphanages in Romania, and this was an interesting example of severe lack of detachment. These poor babies in these orphanages were just basically put in a cot. They were changed, they were fed, they were not interacted with. Going back to the rhesus monkeys, there was no comfort, there was nothing, there was no contact. And these poor children suffered tremendously for this lack of human contact, this lack of attachment. So when there's no attachment figures, it can cause major defects. So it can cause intellectual problems and emotional problems, which are severe. This complete lack of any interaction with the attachment figure, or any attachment figure, has profound impacts. It just shows how important relationships are. We all need other people in varying degrees, but we need other people. So this long-term maternal deprivation can result in delinquency. That's people becoming criminals, delinquent behaviour, reduced intelligence, increased aggression, depression, and even psychopathy. So a lot of psychopathic problems will result from difficulties and problems in the attachment. Now, Bowlby did a study on this, and he gave it an interesting name, the 44 Thieves study. This was done quite early on in 1944. And it's called the 44 Thieves study because he took 44 children, juvenile delinquents, that means children of around about 9, 10, who had been involved with the law for something, had broken the law, or been hooligans, or been in some way broken the law, committed crimes. So he took 44 of these people, and he looked at them, did case histories, studied their background, looked at the situations and their family situations. So to bring in their mothers and do that research. And this is what he found. So of these 44, half of the children had been separated from their mothers for more than 6 months. So half of this group, this delinquent group, had suffered long-term disruptions in their attachment. 6 months for a small child is a very long time. And the results seem to coincide with delinquency. Now, this study was replicated later in 1992, and this time it was a study of 250 women who had lost their mothers. Their mothers had died before the age of 17 years. And it showed the risk of depressive anxiety disorders were doubled for this group. So this group were more likely, twice as likely, to become anxious or depressed and suffer from disorders that would need medical or psychiatric attention. And the highest rate was for women who had lost their mothers before the age of 6 years old. Again, I had a client who came to me, this was a woman in her 70s, who had suffered severe depression all her life, who had a very supportive and loving husband, but would spend days and weeks of her life in bed, not being able to cope, and then getting up and just being able to manage to cope. And we did a case history, we talked about her past, and not surprisingly, but actually quite surprisingly to her, there was a strong connection to what happened to her when she was 3 years old. And at 3, she had lived in a mining village in the north of England. Her mother had died. And she talked at great length and in great detail the experiences she had at 3 years old with her mother dying. She had talked about the funeral, that her mother had been laid to rest in the living room. They lived in a small mining town. Her father was a miner, and how she remembered not going to the funeral, but her father leading off the hearse and the funeral cortege. And this connection between the loss of her mother at 3-year-old and the depression was quite a revelation to her. She kind of managed to see the connection that much of her depression was a depression of a 3-year-old who had suffered a great loss. So this idea of disruptions in the attachment having major impacts later in life. Okay, let's look at applications. So the importance of attachments continues into later life and adolescence. So we're not going to escape our attachment styles. Now, that's not to say they're fixed in stone. It's mean that we have to pay attention to them. We can't pretend that what happened to us didn't happen. We have to really accommodate that and maybe work on that. And that's possible. People do resolve difficulties from childhood, but you don't resolve them by ignoring them, and you don't resolve them by not knowing them. You can only resolve anything by knowing where the problem lies, what the problem is, and then how to manage it, how to counteract it. So any disruption in attachment has a powerful impact on the child. This puts a lot of weight on mothers or first attachment figures. You know, there's a lot of pressure on mothers to get it right. But if you are a mother, and if you know mothers, you know how important they take looking after their children. They kind of know that. They know that it's very important to do their best and to get it right. And we're going to talk a little twist on that a bit later, towards the end of this presentation, about the pressure on mothers to get it right. Okay, so children with very little childhood attachment will struggle with major psychological problems. So I think there's a good case to argue that many serious psychological problems can be traced back to attachment styles. Very early pre-verbal baby experiences are impacting on the adult. And remember, the idea of pre-verbal is that if problems happen at an age where we have language, then we have the resource of language to make sense of the problem. So we can formulate the problem with language. That's a very helpful process. If these problems happen before we have any language, that's say pre-18 months or maybe even 2 years, and then we haven't, no matter how clever we are, no matter how intelligent we haven't got the resource of a language to make sense of that experience. It's pre-verbal. Those early experiences are sensational. They don't have the advantage of ideas and comparisons to attach to. And really, that's the stuff of psychoanalysis, is to help people deal with these complex pre-verbal issues, which take more work to deal with, because, as I say, you don't have the advantage of a language system to make sense of what's going on for you. Okay, we're going to look at attunement and misattunement. This was something that Mary Ainsworth noticed and did some experiments on. It's quite an interesting it's a slight sidestep from attachment, but it's something that happens within the attachment. It's something mothers and babies do together, and it has some important consequences. So Mary Ainsworth identified that mothers tune into their baby's needs and feelings in order to build the attachment. So it's back to this idea of empathy. The mother is picking up on how the child is feeling and responding. The child feels happy, I'm going to respond to that. The child's a little sad, the child's a little distracted, the child's hungry. It's constantly this non-verbal interaction between mother and baby, this communication through empathy, tuning into the baby and tuning into the baby's needs. And the baby's doing the same. And babies will pick up on mum when she's unhappy, or mum when she's sad, or mum when she's tired. Babies are not stupid little creatures. They're very clever. They are empathically knowing what's going on for mother as well. So there's this process of empathy between the mother and the baby. So this exercise, this teaches the baby empathy, and starts to build empathy, not just with the mother but with the child in later relationships. And the degree in which the mother is able to do this will be the degree by which the child will be able to do it. Okay, so this is attunement of emotion, non-verbally, through the feeling process. Now, mothers also have to misattune. So Mary Ainsworth saw how mothers would also deliberately misattune with their children in order for the child to learn to do things for themselves. And now this builds independence of action in the child, because if everything is empathic, if the mother can anticipate simultaneously, or sometimes even before the child knows it's hungry, the mother feeds it. As soon as the child becomes sad, the mother responds. Now, if the mother is constantly empathically tuning into the child, what's the child got to do? Doesn't have to do anything, just has to wait for mother to work it out. Which brings to mind another joke, which teaches me a lot. And it's the story about the couple who are very desperate to have children, and they go to many doctors to try and have a child, and things don't work out. But eventually, finally, they fall pregnant, and they have a little boy. And this is a very loved, precious little boy. And they bring him up, they do a great job, they look after him. But as this boy grows older, he doesn't speak. And this becomes a concern. He doesn't speak at all. And they take him to various doctors and they get various treatments, but the problem can't be solved. We don't know why. The child is perfectly healthy, perfectly normal child, but he does not speak. And as the child's growing older, this becomes more of a problem. And one day, the child is sitting up in bed, and the mother brings it cocoa, a little milky drink for it to go to bed, and baby's sitting up in its bed, and it takes a sip of the drink its mother's given it, and it suddenly says, "Mother, you forgot the sugar." And the mother looks at the child and says, "Well, why didn't you say anything before?" And the child said, "Well, everything's been fine up to now." So you see the point, that if everything's done for the child, there's very little for the child to do. So misattunement comes naturally to the mother. There comes a point where the mother says, "I know what you want, but I'm not going to get it. I know what you're reaching for, but I'm not going to reach for it with you." And this is how Mary Ainsworth was able to measure this. If a child is reaching, grasping for something, in attunement, the mother would lift the child forward, enable the child to reach out and touch the object. But in misattunement, what the mother would do is the mother would see the child trying to grasp an object, and she would just leave it, just let the child get it, and the child would have to shift or move or make some assertion of its own in order to get what it wants. It would misattune to the baby in order to build independence. So again, if we've got mothers who are over empathic and over tuned into their child, that can create a problem, because the child is not going to build a sense of self-esteem or a sense of independence. It's going to wait for everything to be done for it. Now, again, if we have a little think about the people we know and the people around us, we can probably think of maybe one person who's a little bit like that, who likes things done for them, that is not terribly assertive, but will wait for somebody to do it for them. Now that's a child who has had too much attunement and not enough misattunement. Equally, there's a balance here to be had. If the mother's letting the child do everything or try to do everything, that's not helpful. It's the balance between attunement and misattunement, empathy and allowance. I know what you want, but you try yourself. So that's a crucial part of the attachment. Another sideline of this is we're going to look at a thing called the true and false self. Now we're moving away from Bowlby now, because this is the work of Donald Winnicott, who again worked at the Tavistock, wrote some wonderful books, and you see from the picture at the bottom, the Squiggle Foundation. He established the Squiggle Foundation, which is for children and working with children, child psychotherapy. So what Winnicott termed, going back to the idea of the pressure on the mother, Winnicott saw the problem, and he termed he coined the term the good enough mother. Because as we've said, there's an enormous amount of pressure on mothers to get it right, to do everything for the baby that the baby needs in order for the baby to have a good attachment and so forth. And that can make mothers feel like they've got to be perfect, that they've got to get everything right, otherwise it's going to be a massive problem. And much of what I've said before is kind of scary, isn't it? Because if there's disruptions in the attachment, if there's problems here, problems there, these problems can be pretty serious. But the other side of this coin is you don't have to be perfect, you just have to be good enough. And that's what Winnicott understood, that mothers just have to get enough right, and the baby is quite forgiving. So maybe not every time I was hungry you fed me straight away, or not every time I was frightened you came and comforted me, but enough times, you've got a good 4 out of 5. Enough times, if the mother's getting it right enough of the time, then she's doing the job. The job is resolved. Now, if she's only doing it 1 out of 5 times, then there's a problem. But if she's doing it in a good enough way, then the mother is absolutely succeeding and fulfilling her role as providing a good attachment for her child. So that's one thing Winnicott came up with, a crucial kind of adjustment to the pressures of the mother, for the mother. His book, Playing Reality, still in print. If you're interested, very much worth a read. Now, the true and false self. This is the real point that Winnicott made about the attachment and how the attachment can go wrong. So the true self is based upon the child's spontaneous non-verbal gestures derived from instinctual sense. So the mother's looking at the child, and the child is spontaneously reacting, is trying to make a connection with the mother. So it might smile, it might move, it might grasp, it might gesture. And how the mother is responding to that is important. There's this kind of interaction between the mother and the child, and the mother will smile back, will gesture back, will sing, will talk to, will clap, will start to interact on a very basic level with the child. And the child starts to see that its reaction, what it presented to the mother, is being responded to. So I laughed, mummy laughed, Mummy claps the hands and I clap my hands. And you can, with small babies, I do this with my grandchildren, you can play this with quite small babies. You can get them to say with their head, as you say, so where's your head? And you go, where's your head? And quite small babies very quickly get the idea that, head. They probably don't know it's a head, but they copy the gesture. So they're interacting. And this builds up a sense of the true self. So what the mother's doing is says, you're happy, and I can tell you're happy, and that happiness came from you, and you're touching your head just like mummy touches her head. Now the opposite of this is when this response by the mother becomes a basis for the development of the true self. As the mother starts to interact, so the baby is building a sense of itself. And there's another area here which is not really the space for this presentation, to talk about how the baby separates from the mother and gets a sense of their self. But by the mother saying to the baby, this is you, and this is what you do, and this is what you're capable of, and what you're good at. So the mother is giving the baby a sense of its true identity. Now the opposite of this is the false self. So when the child's spontaneity is lost in order to comply with mother's expectations. So if the baby is happy, the mother doesn't want to respond to that. I'm not happy. Mother's not happy, so baby shouldn't be happy. Oh, baby's crying again. I'll just let it cry. So when the mother is not responding and showing empathy to the child, what the child learns from that experience over a period of time, and we're talking months and years, is that what the baby feels is unimportant. What the baby experiences is secondary to what the mother wants. So if the mother wants to play, if the mother wants to come to the baby and have an exciting game, even though the baby may be tired or hungry, it's not appropriate for the baby to play because it's got other needs, but the mother has a need, then the baby realises or latches onto the idea that what mother wants is more important than who I am or what I want. So a false self. The baby starts to try and have to accommodate mother's needs and comply with her rather than its own needs. Now this causes a real problem because, as Winnicott said, other people's expectations can become of overriding importance, overlaying or contradicting the original sense of self. So in the attachment, who the baby is isn't important. Again, this idea of babies' personalities, if many of you will have had more than one baby, or you've got more than one sibling and more than one grandparent, babies very definitely seem to come with personality. They're kind of born with it. The genetically, they're all different. They all have their uniqueness. And it's this uniqueness that can be overridden by the mother's wishes. So the baby loses a sense of its true self. So if the baby is a happy baby, but mother's always sad, but mother's not really interested in how happy the baby is, that true sense of the baby starts to be crushed. And this is a real problem in the attachment. So the false self leads to false relationships, because what the baby is being taught is it doesn't really matter so much what I want, or what I want has to be contained within myself. If I want something, it's got to come from within me, because it's not going to be responded to. Mother's not going to respond to my happiness or my sadness or whatever it may be. Outside relationships become false because they can appear real while concealing an emptiness behind a seemingly independent facade. So the baby's got to appear okay for the mother. It's got to maintain this facade of, yeah, I'm functioning, I'm getting on, and yeah, I'm pleasing you, and what you want is more important than who I am. This problem, this false self, is connected with narcissistic disorder, and we talk about narcissists as having a narcissistic wound. There's a profound wound within them, which I think arguably can be traced back to the attachment, traced back to pre-verbal, very early baby experiences, where the baby was not accepted for themselves but had to comply to others' wishes, had to comply to the mother's wishes, or the mother's situation, or the situation around the baby. That the true identity of the baby was very much secondary, or even third, fourth, fifth down the line. And so this connection with the need to make yourself very important and the centre of things becomes very desperate, because you've not been the centre of things in the attachment. Okay, we're going to look at moving on to sort of more adult systems of attachment. And attachment theory after Bowlby continued, and we continue to look at it in terms of adult experience, and looking back about how the attachments we have made in our early life can be adjusted or moderated or revalued in adult life. Okay, and one system we're going to look at is two systems: the care system and the fear system. And these systems we tend to work out of a lot. We're motivated by these systems in varying degrees. Again, we're talking about degrees. Now, when we say the fear system and the care system, they can be variants on a scale, if you like. But we're going to look first of all at the care system. So, in the care system, someone has a need, and that's the care seeker. Somebody needs care. And someone else is able to fulfill that need. They're a caregiver. And if we think of the example of, a very simple example, I'm thirsty. And my wife gives me a glass of water. So I needed something, and my wife is able to provide me with that need. So this is great because both parties are satisfied, and the goal of me solving my thirst is achieved. And my wife feels happy because she's been able to give me care, and she feels satisfied that she's been able to fulfill that need. I feel satisfied because she's been able to give me something which I needed. And there's a kind of mutual benefit there. We both get something out of this system of care. Now you can expand it out to all kinds of areas for the baby in much larger areas where somebody needs something and somebody's able to come along and provide that need. So the care seeker and the caregiver both benefit because the goal is achieved. Between us, my wife and I, we solve the problem of me being thirsty. So it can be reversed. And that's the beauty of the care system. It's mutual. So the next day, the car's broken down and my wife needs me to phone up and get some help for her. So I become the caregiver and she has become the care seeker. So, it's not that I'm always doing one or the other or she's doing one or the other. It's that we can interact. It becomes a cycle of mutual care. And this is the basis of many successful adult relationships. It's mutual care. Is that nobody is always getting the care and nobody is always receiving the care. Now, there are relationships that are a bit too much like that, certainly, and there's all sorts of problems with that. But when you have a mutual care system, you've got a much more efficient and loving relationship because it's going both ways. Now the fear system, the way I think about the fear system is in terms of cats and rats. And let me just to describe this to you. So in the fear system, we resort to three responses: fight, flight, or freeze. And they you can tell when somebody's in flight mode is that they can become fight mode. They can become argumentative, confrontational, angry. They're fighting. When they're in flight, they're avoidant. Remember when we talked about attachment styles, they're avoidant, they're detached. And in freeze, again, think about the attachment styles we talked about. They're distracted, they're disorganized, they're distant. So in the fear system, we become disorganized and unable to think clearly and explore and learn. We can't explore and learn in the fear system. So cats and rats. If you think about a rat and he's cornered by a cat, can't escape, he's got one option only to survive, and that's to fight. And rats will fight back at cats. They really will. They won't give in to a cat. They will put up a fight because that's how they're going to survive. It's the only way they're going to survive. But if a rat sees a cat and the cat sees the rat immediately knows its best option is to run away. That's the best option, to run, to fly, to escape. Now, if the rat is hiding in a bush and it sees the cat walking by, if it runs away, it might draw attention to itself. But if it freezes, if it sits very, very still, then the cat might not see it and it's going to survive. So these are very much survival instincts. These are hardwired into us. These are survival instincts. But they are survival instincts which can often be very misplaced. Because if we become fearful, we're going to revert back to a very basic, fundamental, primitive way of reacting. We're not thinking, we're not able to interact with our surroundings or within the relationship. We resort back to something which is very basic, pre-verbal and unsophisticated. So people who have had disruptions in their attachment might be more like this. They might in relationships freeze, or they might become very argumentative when they feel unsure of themselves or when they feel unsure of the situation. They might just avoid, they just might leave the relationship, not have friends, not connect with people. This can happen in work situations where people react in odd ways, and it's hard to work out why they're behaving in a certain way. Well, a good clue is something has caused them fear. Something has caused them some anxiety. A danger has been triggered within that person, and they fall back to this primitive response of fight, flight or freeze. What they're not doing is they're not thinking. They're not thinking clearly. They're not considering their position. They're not learning or exploring, because the fear system creates an emotion of disorganization. When we're frightened, we are disorganized. And when we're disorganized, we cannot react in a logical, rational way. We're going to resort back to this very basic instinctual response. So the fear system can be a form of attachment. Some people are negatively, fearfully attached to people. And the best example of this is in abusive relationships. People who have been long-term abused, could be physical, emotional, sexual, can be attached to that abuse. They can be attached to that system of being, because that's what they've learnt, and that's what they assume the attachment is. The attachment is a process of fearfulness and anxiety. And that can be a dreadful hook in keeping people in very negative states of mind, because that's what they've learnt. That's what they assume is their lot, and that's what they assume they can only get. So the fear system will drive out the care system. They cannot coexist together. You're in one or the other. Once you're in the fear system, the care system disappears. But when you're in the care system, then the fear system is diminished. You're in a state where you can think and you can get what you need. You can ask for, seek out and receive care. You know who to go to because you can think through, this is what I need and this is the person that's going to give it to me. So a little bit more about attachment in adult life. So the attachment patterns laid down in childhood will continue into adult relationships, and they're going to impact on all relationships. So it's not just those intimate relationships we have with our partners, it's relationship with friends, at work, with our children, everywhere. The nature and quality of our relationships has been determined or will have been determined. So many relationships many problems that relationships suffer can be traced back to attachment styles. So with your partner, it's good to know what kind of attachment style might they have, what kind of nuances of attachment style might they have, and if you know what yours is, then it's going to help. If you've got two avoidant people, you're going to have a very interesting relationship. You're going to have a couple that keep bouncing apart. You know, they come together, they bounce off, and they come together, they bounce off, and so forth. That's going to be a difficult relationship. If you've got a very ambivalent or resistant person and a very secure person, then it's going to be, again, very problematic, because the secure person is going to be constantly trying to make an attachment, trying to connect, and the other person is going to be avoiding and upset and angry because you may want me now but you're going to leave me eventually. So there's all kinds of problems between different attachment styles in relationships. So a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of understanding and conversation and thought, then these things can make more sense. So many mental health issues can be traced back to attachment styles and disruptions in attachment. So an attention to what's gone in the past is going to help what's happening in the present. Interestingly, in architecture or building, if a building is being erected and you come to a corner, you've got to get a 90-degree angle correct. Because if you're 90.5 degrees and you build out from that angle, then the building's not going to work. You've got to because the degree of error will be magnified the longer the wall is. And so it is with human beings. Is a small degree of difficulty early on will become magnified over years and decades of our lives if it's not addressed, if it's not recognised. Okay, so psychotherapy needs to address the client's attachment by looking at family client history. So taking a family history, talking about in sometimes, not long term but brief periods, what happened to you, what kind of family did you live, were your parents together, did they stay together, what kind of relationship your parents had, where did you live, where did you grow up, did you have siblings, where were you in the family, what kind of family life did you have. These are very important questions in psychotherapy because they build an awareness and understanding that provides an opportunity for change. I can remember I took a family history of a client I had, but there was something that was missing in that family history. And we'd worked for several weeks and there was something not right. I couldn't quite work out. There was something wrong in what was going on in the therapy. And it came out by chance, I think. I said, well, when I was 8, I spent 2 years in hospital. Suddenly made sense. This had been missed in the family history, that this person had been separated from their family. They had I think they'd had cancer as a child, close to death. So they'd been separated, spent 2 whole years in hospital, away from the family. And once that piece of information got slotted in, things started to make more sense. Okay, so adult emotional security is achieved by having to deal with many challenges and stresses over a lifetime. Life is not avoiding challenges, it's overcoming challenges and remembering and learning from each experience. So that's what makes it easier. What makes life easier is learning from experience, is working out what I do now from what I did before. What worked the last time this happened? What helped me the last time I felt like this? How can I resolve this by using what I already know? And this requires a willingness to meet the challenges and explore the problems. So it goes back to this idea. If the attachment style, if the attachment has been problematic, then we are going to be falling into the fear system. We are not going to be able to face up to the ability to think through and learn and explore in order to solve the problems. Problems don't get solved by a lack of attention, they are solved by giving them attention. And a disorganized or avoidant attachment style doesn't enable us to think clearly about what we need to do. Psychotherapy really boils down to thinking about what you have to do, making connections, seeing the starting point and working out what to do next in a logical, rational process. Now that's an awful lot harder to do in reality than it is to say it, but that fundamentally is the issue. So when we've got that ability to solve problems, even though there may be difficulties in our past and difficulties in our childhood, once we get to the state where we can think clearly and provide a care system, sometimes for ourselves, because the care system can sometimes be about self-care. There's a lot of issues that I can resolve for myself. If I get thirsty, I don't always need my wife to bring me a glass of water. I can go and get myself a glass of water. So self-care can be crucial in this. But if we disregard our self-care and fall into bad habits and lack of care, then we're not thinking clearly and we're not able to put ourselves in that position of resolving the problems we face. Just a book that's really worth reading. This is The Challenge of Attachment for Caregiving. This is about adult attachment and dealing with adult attachment issues. It's written by Dorothy Hurd and Brian Lake. Dorothy Hurd worked with John Bowlby, and she's mentioned in all his books, a list of thanks at the beginning of his books, and she worked with him for a number of years. And Dorothy Heard, luckily, she was my supervisor for a number of years as well. I'm afraid they both passed away, but a good book, great book to read. Another book, which is To Be Met as a Person, by Una McCluskey, who works in York. It deals with attachment in adult life. So we've moved on from the baby. This is how we deal with it in adult experience. So we've come to the end, and I'm just going to summarise things. And we're going to say, good attachments allow us to think and explore freely. This provides a psychological resource for us to draw on. So that's why attachments are so crucial, and why we have to pay very careful, special attention to what's going on with the small baby. And while the person who the baby is attached to needs to do an awful lot of work, careful, thoughtful, emotional work, to provide them to have that good attachment. Because once you've got that good attachment, you can do an awful lot later on. It gives you the tools to deal with the problems. Now, you can pick up some of those tools in later life, but once you've got those tools, you've got the ability to draw on resources that are going to enable you to solve the problems. Life will always have problems. The skill to learn is how to overcome problems. So poor attachments will leave us subject more to that fear system. When we don't have the ability to think or to rationalize things, we're going to be falling back into a fear system, which is going to lead us open to all kinds of mental health problems, depressions, anxieties. All those things are going to come in if we don't build the resources to deal with the issues that we face psychologically. So the fear system is disorganisation and will not enable us to explore new ways of coping with difficult emotional events, difficult emotions and events. It helps when you can read properly. So secure babies and adults are able to recover more quickly and cope better with psychological stress. So the more insecure babies can learn to become secure adults. It's not a fait accompli. It's, what happens up to a certain age is done and dusted. Interestingly enough, though, it was often said by the Jesuits, the Jewish priests, they say, give me a child until it's 7 and I have it for its life. So there is an awful lot in what you learn in those formative years, in what you understand. That experience is very powerful. It's not completely impossible to make changes, but the longer it goes on, the more difficult it is going to be to make changes. So it's this balance between the importance of early life and the realization that even if there are things we haven't quite got or quite resolved, that there is some means in which we can make adjustments as adults. But the most important people in the world, children. Well, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And hopefully I will be bringing out some more videos over the next few weeks. Goodbye.